This is his 10th bride. 9 women before her. 9 funerals, each within 10 nights of wearing his name, each without reason, each leaving the Obsidian Peaks with less grief and more quiet certainty that whatever lived inside Michael Hayes had never been a curse. It had always been a sentence. He walked into the selection hall with his jaw locked and his shoulders carrying the particular heaviness of a man who has lowered enough coffins to stop believing in beginnings, only in ends. Last time, he told himself. Choose someone. Keep your distance. Give her a title and a cold room and call it protection. He did not owe them love. He owed them survival. He did not look at their faces. He had learned that lesson by the 3rd burial. He was midway down the row when the air changed. Not the air. His chest. A voice slow, unhurried, landing somewhere beneath sound, somewhere he could not locate or defend against. Choose me. I am the only one in this room who will not need a grave. Thank you for sticking around with me, my wonderful story family. If you are already hooked in on today's story and ready to enjoy it, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. We like to know our pack members from all over the world. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The candles had been burning for 3 hours before Michael Hayes walked through the doors. His advisors called it preparation. His generals called it discipline. The women standing in the selection hall, who had been waiting in silk and perfume and barely contained terror, called it something they would not say aloud. Michael called it what it was. Cowardice. Not the battlefield kind. He had never flinched from a blade, never turned from a battle that was trying to kill him. This was the other kind. The kind that lived in the chest. The kind that had grown a little larger with every funeral, every graveside, every moment he had stood in the rain watching another coffin disappear into ground that his name had poisoned, thinking, I did this. I did this again. 9 times. 9 women. 9 graves, all bearing the same inscription, beloved wife of the King of Obsidian Peaks. As if the stone were mocking him. As if even the words had learned to lie. He pushed through the doors. The hall was luminous with candlelight, and it should have been beautiful, and it was not. It was 31 women in a line so rehearsed it broke something in him quietly, the straightened spines, the careful smiles, the eyes that wanted to run and had been trained not to. They had been told what to wear, what to say, how to hold their fear where he couldn't see it. He could always see it. He had learned to stop looking. He started down the line with his jaw set and his eyes low, and he told himself what he had told himself every time before, 1 pass. 1 name. 1 cold room on a separate floor, and a title that means nothing. That is all you are allowed to give anyone. That is the only mercy left in you. He believed it. He had to believe it. The alternative, that somewhere in this room there was a woman he might actually want to protect, was a thought too dangerous to finish. Wanting to protect someone had not saved a single one of them. It had only made the graves harder to walk away from. He was 12 women in when the cold arrived. Not a draft. Not the season. A specific, intimate cold, the exact temperature of his war room at 3 in the morning, of stone walls and lamplight, and the particular silence of a man who has run out of people to speak to and started talking to the dark instead. His steps slowed. Don't, he told himself. Keep walking. You are tired. You are not sleeping. This is what the inside of a breaking mind feels like, and you already know that, so keep walking. He kept walking. And then the scent reached him. Petrichor. Rain meeting earth. The cold, clean smell of the mountain before a storm, of ground that had never been owned by anyone, of every midnight he had spent in that war room pressing his palm flat against the stone and saying things he would never say to a living face, his failures, his fear. The names of the dead spoken in order, so he would not forget them, so someone would hear them even if that someone was only silence. Something cracked open in his chest. Old. Wordless. The feeling of recognizing something he had no memory of losing. And then the voice came. Not in the room. Not in the air. somewhere behind his sternum, somewhere that had no defense and had never needed one because nothing had ever found it before. You have walked this line 9 times, Michael. 9 times you chose someone you were trying not to love, and 9 times the earth took them anyway. You do not need a bride. You need the one who has already been with you. The one who already knows every name you have ever spoken into the dark. He stopped walking. Every muscle in his body locked. His mind was screaming that this wasn't real, that grief did this, that sleeplessness did this, that a man who had buried 9 wives in 9 years had earned a haunting or 2, and this was simply the latest one. But his body was not listening to his mind. His body was already turning. She stood at the end of the line. He did not know how he had missed her. He was trained to see everything, every exit, every threat, every shift in a room's weight. But she had not been there a moment ago, or she had been there always, in the way that certain things exist so completely that the eye stops registering them as new. Her gown was not silk. It was something the color of ash and pale stone, something that looked less like it had been sewn and more like it had simply settled around her. Her veil was plain. Her hands were open at her sides, not posed, not performing, not gripping anything for comfort. She was the only woman in the room who was not afraid. She was the only woman in the room who was looking directly at him. And before Michael could breathe, before he could construct a single wall against it, the voice returned, softer now, and so unbearably specific that his eyes burned with something he had not allowed himself in years. I heard you the night you spoke your mother's name. I heard you the night you said you were tired. I heard every word you believed no living soul would ever receive. I have been receiving them for 9 years, Michael. You have never been as alone as you thought you were. His hand, hanging at his side, was shaking. His throat had closed completely. 31 women behind him. Every advisor in the kingdom watching. 9 graves in the ground and a 10th selection, and the full terrible weight of a curse. He had stopped believing he deserved to survive. And 1 woman at the end of the line who was looking at him not with fear, not with ambition, not with the careful blankness of someone performing bravery, but with the quiet recognition of someone who had already seen the worst of him. And stayed. He turned to the chamberlain. Opened his mouth to say her name, except he did not know her name yet, and somehow that made it worse, made his chest tighten around the word until it was barely sound at all. But before it left him, every candle in the hall extinguished. All 37. Simultaneously. In the darkness that followed, thick and absolute and smelling of petrichor, only one thing remained, the soft, certain warmth of a presence at the end of the line. And her voice, one final time, placed directly against the inside of his ribs like something that had always lived there. Now choose me. Before they relight the candles. Before you lose your nerve again. The chamberlain was fumbling for a match. Michael Hayes stood in the dark with 9 funerals behind him and something he did not have a name for pressing against the walls of his chest. And for the first time in 9 years, his hands had stopped shaking. Chapter 2. He had never told anyone about the wall. Not his generals. Not his advisors. Not the priest who came every spring to bless the castle's foundations and leave faster than he arrived. Not even Damon, his beta, his oldest friend, the man who had pulled 3 arrows out of Michael's back on a battlefield and called it a Tuesday. No one knew that the king of Obsidian Peaks, the Widowmaker, the Cursed, the man written about in border towns as a warning and not a legend, spent his worst nights in the war room, alone, speaking to the stone. It had started the night after the first funeral. Vera. Her name was Vera. She had been 19 years old, and she had laughed at breakfast the morning she died, and Michael had not been fast enough, had not been watchful enough, had not understood yet what it meant to carry his name into a room where someone fragile was sleeping. He had gone to the war room because it was the only place in the castle that had never held a woman's voice, never held warmth, never held anything but maps and strategy and the cold practicality of a king who had stopped being a man. He had pressed his palm against the northern wall and he had said, out loud, into nothing, I don't know what I am. The stone had been warm. Not room temperature warm. Not the residual warmth of a fire burned down to embers. Something deliberate. Something that felt, impossibly, like an answer. He had told himself it was the stonework. Old castles did strange things. He had gone to bed and not slept and never mentioned it to anyone. The second wife died on the 7th night. Her name was Camille. He went back to the wall. By the third funeral, he had stopped pretending he was going for any other reason. He went because the wall was warm. He went because the stone seemed to lean into his palm the way a living thing leans into comfort. He went because in a castle full of people who feared him, it was the only surface in his world that did not flinch. He started talking. Slowly at first, fragments, half-sentences, the kinds of things that die in the throat before they can become real. I think the curse is inside me and not around me. And then, months later, crouched on the cold floor with his back against the stone like a man too tired to stand, I think I was supposed to be someone different. Before all of this, I think there was a version of me that knew how to be in a room without killing it. The wall was always warm. The wall always listened. By the 5th year, he was telling it things he had never told anyone living. His mother's name, how she had smelled like cedar and rain, how she had died on a morning that looked like every other morning, how no one had warned him that grief had no season and no schedule and could arrive without warning in the middle of a war council because the wind came through the window at a particular angle. He told it about the first battle he had lost. The names of the men. All 11 of them. He told it that he was afraid of the dark in a way he had never admitted to, not the absence of light, but the presence of silence, the specific silence that had a weight and a shape and lived in the hours just before dawn. He told it, on the night after the 7th funeral, pressed flat against the stone with both hands like a man trying to hold a wall up through sheer will. I think I am going to be alone forever. And I think I deserve it. And I think those two things are supposed to feel different and they don't. The warmth that night had been almost unbearable. Like being held by something that had no arms. He had wept. Against the stone, in the dark, completely alone. He had wept in a way he had not permitted himself since childhood, without strategy, without dignity, without anything. And from somewhere deep inside the wall, so faint he would spend years convincing himself he had imagined it, he heard something. Not words. A heartbeat. Steady. Ancient. And entirely, unmistakably, alive. He had pulled his hands back like the stone had burned him. He had not returned for 6 weeks. And when he finally did, because he always came back, because the war room was the only place in the kingdom that felt like it already knew him, he pressed his palm to the wall and said, in a voice gone rough from the silence of the weeks between, "Was that you?" The stone pulsed once beneath his hand. Just once. And Michael Hayes, king of the Obsidian Peaks, veteran of 9 funerals and 100 battles, had stood in the dark and understood, with a certainty that bypassed every rational thought he possessed, that whatever was inside that wall had been listening to him for years. He should have told someone. He should have called the priest. The builders. Anyone. Instead, after a long silence, he had lowered himself to the floor, his back against the stone, and said, "Then I have a few more things to tell you." What he did not know, what he could not have known, with his hand warm against the stone and his voice low and his whole exhausted soul cracked open in the dark, was that on the other side of that wall, something ancient and imprisoned and desperately, dangerously awake had just made a decision. A decision that would take 9 more years to execute. And would cost her everything she was. Chapter 3. The wedding had lasted 40 minutes. Michael had made sure of it. No feast, no dancing, no ceremonial wine shared from a single cup while the court watched with the particular hunger of people who needed something to believe in. He had signed the binding document, spoken the required words in a voice that gave nothing away, and walked his new wife through the castle doors before the ink had fully dried. He told himself it was mercy. He was very good at telling himself things. Her name, he had learned in the hour between the selection hall and the ceremony, was Nora Garcia. She had given it to the Chamberlain quietly, with no family name attached, no title, no lineage offered for verification. The advisors had flagged it as irregular. Michael had overruled them. He was past the point of caring about paperwork. He was focused entirely on getting through the next 10 nights without a funeral. Distance, he had decided. Total, disciplined, non-negotiable distance. No shared meals. No conversation beyond necessity. No learning the way she took her tea or what made her laugh or whether she was afraid of storms. Those were the details that made a person real to you, and real was dangerous, and dangerous got people buried. He showed her the room himself. It was on the east wing, 3 floors above his own, as far from the war room as the castle's geometry allowed. He had chosen it deliberately. He had also chosen it because it was the warmest room in the castle, with southern windows and a fireplace that drew well, and he was a man who hated himself just enough to make sure she wouldn't be cold while he was keeping her alive by staying away from her. She stood in the center of it and looked around slowly, unhurried, the way she had stood in the selection hall, not performing, not filling the silence with nervous conversation. Just present. Just taking the room in. It unnerved him completely. The rules, he said, from the doorway, because the doorway was as far inside as he intended to go. She turned and looked at him. You sleep here. I sleep below. We will not share meals unless the court requires a public appearance, in which case you will sit beside me, say very little, and give them nothing to write about. You will have everything you need, a fire, food, books if you want them. You will not lack for anything material. He paused, studied something in his chest. What you will not have is a husband. Not in any real sense. That is not cruelty. That is the only protection I have left to offer anyone. Silence. She was still looking at him with those eyes that had no fear in them, and it was doing something to his ability to hold the speech together. 9 women, he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. 9 women are in the ground with my name on their headstones. I will not put you there. This is how I prevent it. Distance. Separation. You survive by staying away from me, and he stopped. Exhaled. I will sleep better knowing you are 3 floors up and breathing. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, simply and without accusation, you've been alone for a very long time. The words landed somewhere he had no defense for. Good night, he said. He pulled the door shut before she could see his face. He made it to the stairwell. Stood there in the dark with his hand pressed flat against the stone wall. Habit, reflex, 9 years of muscle memory, and breathed. The wall was warm. Warmer than it should have been. Warmer than stone had any right to be with the nearest fireplace 40 feet away. He pulled his hand back. She is up there, he thought. And the wall is warm. He stood very still in the dark while the implication of that assembled itself inside his chest like something with edges. He had put her in the room furthest from the war room. But the wall was warm everywhere now. Every wall. The entire castle. Chapter 4. He lasted 4 days. 4 days of total discipline, of separate meals and separate floors, and the particular exhaustion of a man who is working very hard at something that should require no work at all. 4 days of signing documents he barely read and attending councils he barely heard, because some part of his attention had quietly defected and was now permanently stationed 3 floors above him, listening for footsteps that moved differently than everyone else's. She did not walk like a woman who was afraid of the castle. She walked like she owned the ground beneath it. He told himself he hadn't noticed. He was very good at telling himself things. The 5th morning, he rounded the corridor outside the East Library and walked directly into her. It was a single second of contact, her shoulder against his arm, his hand catching her elbow before she stumbled, one breath of proximity before they both stepped back. A moment so brief it should have registered as nothing. Except the scent hit him like a physical force. Petrichor. Rain-soaked earth. The cold, specific smell of the mountain in the hour before a storm breaks, of stone walls at midnight, of 9 years of pressed palms and whispered confessions and a warmth that had no rational explanation. His hand was still on her elbow. He released it. "Forgive me," he said, and his voice came out wrong, too careful, too controlled, the voice of a man deploying tremendous effort to sound normal. "You didn't hurt me," Nora said. She was looking at him the way she always looked at him. Like she was waiting for him to catch up to something she already knew. He walked away at a pace that was not quite a retreat. He made it to the war room in under 4 minutes. Closed the door. Stood in the center of the room while his chest did something complicated and involuntary, while his mind ran the scent back over itself trying to find an explanation that wasn't the one assembling itself with horrible clarity in the back of his skull. He had smelled that before. Not on a woman. Not in a garden or a perfumer's shop or anywhere that smell had any right to exist. He had smelled it here, in this room, on the worst nights, the nights when the grief was loudest and the silence most absolute, and he had pressed his face against the stone and simply stopped pretending he was holding together. On those nights, the wall had smelled like rain. He crossed to it now. The northern wall. His wall. He pressed both palms flat against the stone. It was warm. It was always warm now, had been warm since the night of the selection, but today it was something beyond warm. It was the warmth of something awake, something present, something that recognized the specific weight of his hands and leaned into it. 9 years, the voice in the selection hall had said. "You have been speaking to me for 9 years." The wall pulsed once beneath his palms. He stepped back. His mind was a man standing at the edge of a cliff who can see the bottom clearly and is choosing, with tremendous deliberate effort, not to look. Because looking made it real. Because real meant the woman in the east wing with the unhurried eyes and the ancient scent and the voice that arrived below sound, meant she wasn't simply a woman. Meant she never had been. Meant the thing he had been confessing to for 9 years had not been silence. His legs carried him to the door before the thought finished forming. Up the stairs, 2 floors, 3, the east corridor, her door, and he knocked before he understood he was going to, with more force than he intended, with the hands that were still warm from the wall. Silence. Then footsteps. Unhurried. The door opened. Nora stood in the lamplight, and she was already watching him with an expression that was not surprise, that was not confusion, that was the quiet, patient look of a woman who has been waiting for a specific moment for a very long time, and knows it has finally arrived. "You felt it," she said. Not a question. Behind him, from somewhere deep inside the castle walls, every stone in the obsidian peaks began, very softly, to hum. Chapter 5. She did not answer his question that night. He had stood in her doorway with the hum of the castle walls vibrating through the soles of his boots, and she had looked at him with that ancient, patient expression and said you felt it, and then said nothing else. Just watched him. Waited for him to speak first, the way she always waited, the way something with unlimited time learns to wait. He had asked her, finally, in a voice stripped of everything but the raw shape of the words, "What are you?" And she had looked at him for a long moment, with something that was almost tenderness and almost grief, and said, "Ask me on the 11th morning, if it comes." He had not slept since. He sat in the war room with his back against the northern wall and a candle burning low on the table, and every muscle in his body coiled and motionless, counting hours the way he had counted them 9 times before, like a man rationing the last of something he was terrified to run out of. Listening for footsteps in the corridor. A servant's knock. "My king." "I am so sorry." Again. The candle guttered and died. He lit another. Midnight arrived and passed without sound. The hour after midnight. The one after that. He counted every one of them with the particular focus of a man who understands, bone deep, that attention is the only prayer left to him. The wall behind him pulsed steadily, warm as a living thing, warm as something breathing. At the 4th hour, he stopped being able to feel his legs and did not move anyway. At the 5th hour, something cracked in his chest, not breaking, but opening. The specific sensation of a man who has been braced so long against impact that his body has forgotten how to stand without it. Dawn came. Slow at first. Then sudden. Gray light bleeding through the war room's narrow windows, falling across the maps on the table, across the hands of a king who had been still so long he had become part of the room. He held his breath. And then he heard it. Footsteps. 3 floors above. The particular unhurried rhythm of someone who walked like they owned the ground beneath them, steady, deliberate, the cadence of something that had never once hurried because it had always understood that time moved around it, not past it. Alive. He pressed his fist to his mouth and held everything inside it that had been building for 10 nights and 9 funerals and 9 years of a wall that was warmer than stone had any right to be. Outside, the mountains exhaled. He heard it before he saw it, a low resonant sound that had no name in any language he knew, as if the obsidian peaks had been holding something enormous inside them and had only now decided to let it go. He crossed to the window. The peaks were green. Not the thin, apologetic green of high-altitude scrub. Something ancient and absolute, something that moved in the early light as though it had always existed beneath the surface and was only now being permitted to show itself. Moss climbing blackstone. Grass splitting frost-hardened ground. Far up the slopes where nothing had grown in living memory, entire faces of the mountain were turning from dark to alive. He stood at the window until Damon knocked. His beta entered, looked at Michael's face, looked past him at the mountains, and carefully reassembled his expression. The court is asking whether to prepare. No. The physicians. Send them home. Damon was quiet for a moment. Then, the people are gathering at the gates. They're saying the curse is broken. A pause. They're saying her name. Her name. Michael was already moving. He took the stairs without quite running, which was the closest he had come to running since he was a boy who still believed things could be reached in time. 3rd floor. East corridor. Her door, which was standing open in a way that hit him wrong before he even reached it. The room was empty. The fire had burned down to cold ash. The bed had not been slept in. The room held no warmth, no scent, no trace of the particular presence that had occupied it for 11 days. Nothing. Except the floor. In the center of the room where she had stood, the stone had split. A single crack, deep and clean and still faintly warm to the touch, running from wall to wall like something had torn itself free from inside it. Like something had finally been released. He pressed his palm flat against the fractured stone. It was the same warmth as the war room wall. The same pulse. The same specific, unmistakable feeling of something alive. And then, from somewhere beneath the castle, beneath the foundations, beneath the roots of the mountain itself, the hum that had started last night in the walls intensified into something he could feel in his back teeth. And Nora's voice arrived in his chest, not gentle this time, not patient. Urgent. Michael, they know I've surfaced. And they're already coming. Chapter 6. He found the vault the way his father had always intended him to find it. By accident. He had torn through the east wing looking for her, every room, every corridor, every door that hadn't been opened since before his father's reign, and found nothing but dust and cold air and the particular silence of spaces that had been deliberately emptied. No Nora. No trace of her. Only that hum in the walls, growing, and her voice in his chest saying they are already coming on a loop he could not stop hearing. He was descending to the war room when his boot heel caught the seam. A single flagstone in the stairwell, flush with the others in every visible way, except that when his weight hit it wrong it gave, just slightly, just enough, with the soft, yielding resistance of something counterweight. Something engineered. He crouched. His fingers found the groove. His body understood what his mind was still processing. He pulled. The stone lifted clean. Below it, stairs. narrow and descending, cut from the same black rock as the mountain, smelling of ash and old iron and something underneath those things, something organic and ancient and wrong in a way he felt in his stomach before he identified it. He went down anyway. The chamber at the bottom was small. A single lantern, long dead, hung from a ceiling hook. A table. On the table, a metal box sealed with a lock that bore his family crest, the same crest that was on his ring, the same crest on the 9 headstones in the eastern yard. He broke the lock with his boot heel. Inside, scrolls. 12 of them, bound in a leather that had darkened with age, each one sealed with a wax stamp he recognized as his father's personal mark, not the royal seal, not the official one. The private one. The one his father had used only for things he didn't want recorded. He opened the first one. His father's handwriting. Dense and precise, the handwriting of a man who trusted nothing to memory. Year 1 of the binding. The spirit has been contained within the northern foundation wall as the terms require. The oath holds. The power transfer is complete. Michael's hands were very still. He opened the second scroll. Year 4. The spirit is resistant. There are signs of attempted surfacing, warmth in the stones, moisture in the eastern corridors where no moisture should exist. The binding is holding, but the architect warns it may not hold indefinitely. The kingdom's prosperity is contingent on her continued imprisonment. This is the price of the peaks. This has always been the price. The price of the peaks. He was reading faster now, the scrolls unrolling in his hands with the particular urgency of a man dismantling something he cannot stop once he has started. Year 11. The spirit has gone quiet. Whether this is surrender or strategy is unclear. The important thing is the terms are met. One earth spirit, willingly imprisoned, powers the wards that keep the obsidian peaks fertile, protected, unconquerable. My grandfather called it a bargain. I call it what it is. We took her. We built our kingdom on what we took. My son will inherit this truth when he is ready for it. He will never be ready for it. So I will take it to my grave. Michael set the scroll down. He sat in his father's hidden chamber beneath the castle his father had built on a woman's stolen existence, and he sat very still while the understanding assembled itself inside him with the slow, terrible thoroughness of a structure being completed. The 9 wives. Not killed by a curse on him. Killed by the earth demanding payment for what his bloodline owed it. Every woman who had entered this castle had walked into a debt she didn't know existed. Nora had known. Nora had always known. She had broken herself free and walked into the selection hall and chosen him, not despite what his family had done to her, but because of it. Because she was the only one who could survive the debt. Because she was the debt. He was already on his feet when the castle shook. Not an earthquake. Not a tremor. A knock. Something vast and ancient and furious, striking the foundations of the obsidian peaks from below. Demanding what was owed. Chapter 7. He found her in the war room. Of course he did. She was standing at the northern wall with both palms pressed flat against the stone, her back to the door, her head bowed, and the room around her was doing things rooms were not supposed to do. The lanterns were burning sideways. The maps on the table were lifting at their edges, as if caught in a wind that existed only in this room. The temperature had dropped and risen simultaneously, cold at the floor, burning at the ceiling, and the hum he had been feeling in his back teeth for hours had graduated into something he felt in his sternum, in his jaw, in the backs of his eyes. Nora. She turned. He had been looking at her face for 11 days. He had memorized it in the way a man memorizes something he is pretending not to look at, the angles of it, the particular quality of stillness in it, the eyes that held no fear and never had. He thought he knew what she looked like. He did not know what she looked like. The woman standing at his northern wall was lit from inside. Not metaphorically. Not the way people describe beauty when they lack better language. Literally illuminated, a pale gold light moving beneath her skin the way light moves beneath water, shifting and continuous, emanating most strongly from her hands where they had touched the wall and from her eyes, which had gone the color of deep earth, rich brown threaded with living green. Her hair was lifting, slowly, without drama, simply rising as if gravity had made a quiet exception. She was the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He understood, standing in the doorway of his war room with his father's scroll still in his hand, that these two things were the same thing and had always been. "You read them," she said. Her voice had changed, still hers, still the voice that had lived in his chest for 9 years, but layered now, resonant, as if several versions of the same voice were speaking in close succession. "All 12. He stepped inside. "How long have you known I would find them?" "Since your father sealed them." She turned fully toward him, and the light intensified briefly, and he did not step back. He was done stepping back. "I felt him hide them. I feel everything that happens in these walls, Michael. I felt every funeral. I felt you every night, pressing your hands to the stone." Something moved across her face that was grief and fury and something older than either. "I felt what his choices cost you, and I could not tell you. The binding prevented it. You could have told me in this election hall." "I could have." She held his gaze. "Would you have believed me?" He said nothing, because the answer was no, and she knew it, and they both knew it. The castle shuddered. Plaster dust sifted from the ceiling. Somewhere beneath the foundations the knocking had become a sustained pressure, deliberate, rhythmic, the kind of force that was not trying to break through quickly, but was content to simply keep going until something gave. "They've been waiting a long time," Nora said, without looking away from him. The light beneath her skin pulsed in time with the pressure from below. "When I surfaced and took a mortal form, I broke the terms of the original binding. The council has the right to come for me. The right to take back what your family took from them." Her voice was steady. Her eyes were not. "And to take payment from the bloodline responsible." "That's me," Michael said flatly. "Yes. What do they want?" She looked at him for a long moment, the look of someone who has been carrying an answer for a very long time and has not yet decided whether the other person is ready for its weight. "They have 2 demands," she said finally. The foundations struck again. Harder. A crack opened in the ceiling and ran the length of the room in under a second. "The first," Nora said, "is me." "And the second?" The light inside her blazed suddenly, gold and fierce and ancient, filling the room, filling his eyes, filling everything. "Your life," she whispered. "Or mine. One of us has to pay what was owed." And Michael, her voice broke, just once, just slightly, the first fracture he had ever heard in it. "They're going to let you choose which one." Chapter 8. He did not choose. Not immediately. Not the way the council intended, the way powerful things always intended, with urgency weaponized into compliance, with catastrophe held at the door like a creditor who knows you cannot pay. Michael Hayes had been making impossible choices since he was 19 years old. He had learned that the first response to an impossible choice was never the answer. It was always the trap. "Tell me about the equal binding," he said. Nora went very still. "You know about that," she said. "Not a question. I know about everything in those 12 scrolls. My father was thorough." He kept his eyes on her face, on the light moving beneath her skin, on the fracture in her voice that had not reappeared, but that he could not stop hearing. "Tell me what the scrolls didn't say." Before she could answer, the war room doors blew open. Not from wind. From intention. Both doors simultaneously, striking the walls with a sound like a body hitting stone, and in the space where they had been, where ordinary air should have been, was something that was not ordinary air and had never been. They came through the floor first. 3 of them, then 5, then more than he could count, with a moving number of figures assembled from the materials of the earth itself, from packed soil and river stone and the deep black rock of the peaks, their forms suggesting human shape the way shadows suggest the thing that casts them. Their eyes, when they had eyes, were the pale flat white of limestone. Their voices, when they spoke, were not individual sounds, but a collective pressure that arrived inside the skull and bypassed the ears entirely. The binding is broken. The debt is called. Return what was taken. The floor cracked between Michael and Nora in a line so clean it looked deliberate. Michael stepped across it. Nora grabbed his arm. Don't. I'm not stepping back. Michael. I spent 9 years talking to a wall, he said, and his voice was completely level, the voice he used in battles, the voice that had nothing left in it but clarity. I spent 9 years thinking I was alone, and I was not alone. I spent 9 years thinking my touch was lethal, and it was not my touch at all. My father did this. My bloodline did this. And every single consequence of that has been carried by you and by 9 women who deserve to live, and I am done. He turned fully toward the council figures, his scarred hands open at his sides, his spine straight. Standing still while the people around me pay for what the men before me took. The temperature in the room dropped to something that was no longer metaphor. His breath came out in hard white clouds. Ice formed on the edges of the maps. The lanterns cracked and went dark one by one, and the only light remaining was the gold emanating from Nora behind him, and the cold pale luminescence of the council filling the room like a tide coming in. The choice is simple, the council said, inside all of their skulls simultaneously. The spirit returns to the binding. Or the bloodline ends. There is no third option. There is no negotiation. There is only the debt. There is the equal binding, Michael said. The room went absolutely silent. Even the hum in the walls stopped. The council figures did not move. But something in the quality of their stillness changed, the way stillness changes when something has been surprised and is processing whether to show it. Beside him, Nora's hand tightened on his arm so hard it would leave marks. Michael, she said quietly. Urgently. You don't understand what the equal binding costs. I know it costs your immortality. It costs me everything I am. Every connection to the earth. Every piece of power I have spent 100 years building. I would be fully human. Aging, mortal, breakable. Everything I gave up those things to avoid being. Her voice was controlled and frightened and furious, and it was the most honest he had ever heard her. I would become the thing I watched 100 generations of women become and lose. I know, he said. You cannot ask that of me. I'm not asking. He turned to look at her, at the light inside her, at the ancient furious eyes, at the fracture that had reappeared in her voice and was spreading. I'm telling you, I will not choose your life over yours. I will not stand here and let a debt I didn't create cost you 100 more years. Whatever the equal binding requires from me, blood, power, years, all of it, I am offering it. The council moved. Not toward the door. Toward them. A collective surge, the pressure of it physical and immense, the temperature dropping another degree with every inch they covered, the floor fracturing in lines radiating from their approach like impact cracks in glass. Nora stepped forward. In front of him. The light blazed. For one suspended, breathless moment, the ancient earth spirit stood between the council and the king, luminous and furious and fully, terribly herself, and the council stopped. Because whatever Nora was in her mortal disguise, whatever diminished, contained, accessible version of herself she had been performing for 11 days, this was not that. This was what the binding had been built to hold. This was what had taken a century of blood oath to contain. You would invoke the equal binding, the council said. The tone had shifted. Not softened, recalibrated. The way an opponent recalibrates when they realize the fight is different than they planned. I would, Nora said. I invoke the right of willing surrender. Witnessed by the bloodline. Sealed by choice and not by force. Her voice was resonant and layered and terrified, and she was doing it anyway. But I have conditions. You are not in a position. I am the only position, she said. I am what you came for. You need my willing surrender, or the equal binding fails, and the debt resets to the beginning. You know that. I know that. The light intensified until Michael had to shield his eyes. So you will hear my conditions. or you will leave this castle empty-handed and wait another century for a woman willing enough to give herself up." The council's cold presence churned, roiled. The room groaned around them, then went still. "Speak your conditions." Michael reached out, found Nora's hand in the blazing light, held it. She held back. Her hand was shaking. Chapter 9. Her conditions were 3. The first, the Obsidian Peaks and everyone in them would be held harmless. The debt of the Hayes bloodline, every drop of it, would be absorbed into the equal binding and dissolved. No retribution. No residual claim. The kingdom would be free. The council's cold presence shifted, churned, then settled. Granted. The second, the 9 women buried in the eastern yard would be acknowledged by the council as innocent. Their names spoken aloud in the spirit record, their deaths recorded as sacrifice and not as consequence. Not erased. Honored. A longer silence this time. Granted. Michael's hand tightened around hers. The third condition she did not speak aloud. She turned to him instead, in the blazing light and the fractured room, with the council filling the edges of everything and the cold pressing in from all sides, and she looked at him the way she had looked at him in the selection hall, patient, certain. The look of a woman who has already decided and is simply waiting for the moment to arrive. "The third condition is you," she said quietly. "I need you to understand what you are witnessing. Not as a king. Not as the man who carries his bloodline's debt. As the man who spoke to me for 9 years in the dark." Her voice broke slightly on the last word, and she let it, and he understood that she was allowing him to see the fracture because she trusted him with it. "I need you to know I am choosing this. Not because I have to. Because I want to. And I need you to not let me be noble about it alone." He did not trust his voice. So he lifted her hand and pressed it flat against his chest, against the sternum, the place where her voice had always arrived. The place that had recognized her before his mind caught up. She closed her eyes. "Then we begin," she said. The council moved inward. Not aggressively, ritually. Their forms shifting from the threatening to the ceremonial, assembling around the two of them in a ring that hummed with something ancient and irrevocable. The temperature steadied. The fractures in the floor stopped spreading. The room itself seemed to exhale. And then the light began to leave her. Not all at once. Gradually, the way dawn leaves the sky, not in a moment, but in increments so slow you almost miss each one until you look back and realize how much has changed. The gold beneath her skin dimmed first at her hands, then moved upward through her arms, her shoulders, her throat. Her hair, which had been lifted by something that wasn't wind, settled slowly back. She did not make a sound. But her grip on his hand became something that was going to leave marks that would last for weeks, and he did not move, and he did not look away from her face. Her eyes, when she opened them, were still brown, but the green threading through them, the living green that had moved like something growing, was fading. Strand by strand. The color of old-growth forest, becoming the color of earth, becoming the color of something simply, quietly human. "There it is," she whispered. "Stay with me," he said. It was not a command. It was not a king speaking. It was the voice he had only ever used against a stone wall at midnight, stripped of everything except the truth underneath it. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "That is rather the point." The last of the light left her. The council receded. Slowly, collectively, the way tide recedes, not defeated, simply concluded. Their cold diminished. The room's temperature began, tentatively, to rise. One by one the fractured stones stilled. And Nora Garcia stood in the war room of the Obsidian Peaks, fully human, fully mortal, her hand pressed against the chest of the man she had listened to for 9 years in the dark, and breathed. He felt it, the exact moment her breathing changed from something vast and ancient to something small and regular and fragile and real. He wrapped both arms around her and held on. She let him. Outside, the mountains were green in the early light, and the air smelled of rain, and somewhere in the eastern yard 9 headstones stood in a row under a sky that was clear for the first time in a century. Then Nora pulled back slightly, just enough to look up at him, and the expression on her face sent ice straight through his chest. Something was wrong. "Michael," she said softly, "there is something I didn't tell the council. Something I didn't tell you." Her newly human hand, warm and no longer luminous, pressed harder against his chest. "The equal binding doesn't just take my immortality." Her eyes held his, steady and frightened and completely certain. "It requires an anchor. A living one. A breath. The binding is inside you now. And if you die..." The war room doors blew open again. But this time, it was not the council standing in the doorway. Chapter 10. It was Damon. His beta stood in the shattered doorway with his sword drawn and his chest heaving and the particular wild-eyed look of a man who had run through an entire castle toward the sound of something catastrophic and arrived too late to help and too early to understand what had happened. He took in the fractured floor, the extinguished lanterns, the fading cold, and then Michael and Nora standing in the center of it all alive, upright. Her hand pressed against Michael's chest and his arms around her, and the room smelling of petrichor and something ancient just departed. Damon lowered his sword slowly. "I missed it," he said. "You missed it," Michael confirmed. A pause. "Is she human?" Nora said. "Entirely and inconveniently." Damon looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man recalibrating everything he thought he understood about the last 11 days. Then he sheathed his sword, turned to Michael, and said with tremendous careful neutrality, "I have questions." "Later," Michael said. "Many questions." "Later, Damon." His beta looked between them once more, read the room with the efficiency of a man who had survived 20 years of service to a king by knowing precisely when to press and precisely when to leave, and quietly pulled the broken doors as closed as their broken hinges would allow. His footsteps retreated down the corridor. The war room settled into silence. Nora exhaled slowly against Michael's chest, and he felt it, that small, fragile, entirely mortal breath, and tightened his arms around her before he had made any conscious decision to do so. "Tell me the rest of it," he said into her hair. "About the anchor." She was quiet for a moment. Not performing calm, actually finding it, the way he had watched her find things, from the inside out, with effort, with honesty. "The binding lives in you now. It's not a curse. It's not a sentence. It's a connection. The equal binding requires a living anchor to hold the terms in place, to confirm that the choice was willing and witnessed and real." She pulled back enough to look up at him. "It means the peaks remain healed as long as you live. It means the debt is truly dissolved. It means we're bound," he said. "We were already bound," she said simply. 9 years, Michael. This just makes it legible to the earth." He looked at her face. The fully, completely human face, no light beneath the skin, no green threading through the brown of her eyes, no ancient resonance layering her voice into something that arrived before sound. Just a woman, looking up at him in a room full of rubble and cold ash and the aftermath of something enormous. He had never seen anything so devastating in his life. "You gave up everything," he said. "I gave up immortality," she corrected. "That is not the same as everything." Something moved in her expression, not performance, not strategy, just truth, unguarded and direct. Everything was 9 years of a wall and one man who talked to it. Everything was the 11 days after. Everything was the moment you stepped across the floor toward a council that could have unmade you. Her voice, human now and therefore breakable, did something at the edges. Immortality was just time. "I have already found the thing worth spending it on." He did not have words for what was in his chest. So he did the only thing that felt equal to it. He took her hand, led her out of the war room, through the shattered castle corridors, past the wide-eyed servants and the advisors who opened their mouths and closed them again at the particular expression on the king's face, up 3 flights of stairs and out through the eastern tower door onto the ramparts that overlooked the obsidian peaks. And they stopped. The mountains were extraordinary. Not just the green of the morning, though the green was extraordinary, deep and continuous and spreading even now, visible to the eye in the way that plants only move visibly when something has accelerated them beyond the natural rate. But the light. The late afternoon light of the peaks in the first hour of their restoration, falling across slopes that had been black and barren for a century, catching in the new growth and fracturing into something that had no name in any language Michael knew. The sky above the mountains was the precise color of a wound that has finally, actually healed. Nora stood beside him and looked out at it and made a sound he had never heard from her, quiet and involuntary and entirely human, the sound of a person encountering something beautiful after a very long time in the dark. "I forgot," she said softly, "what it looks like from the outside. How long since you've seen it?" 100 years. She exhaled slowly. "I felt it. I could always feel it, the seasons, the growth, the rain. But feeling is not the same as seeing." She turned her face toward the mountains the way people turn their faces toward heat. "It's different with human eyes. Smaller. More," she paused, searching. "More precious. Because it won't always be there. Because I won't always be here to see it." He understood what she meant. Mortality was a thing she was learning in real time, standing beside him on the ramparts while the sun descended toward the peaks she had once been part of. She was learning it the way a person learns a language by immersion, not from study, but from being inside it, from having it be the only available tongue. He had been living in it his whole life. 50 years, he said. If the healers are optimistic. 50 years, she agreed. That's not very long. No, she said. It isn't. She turned to look at him, and there was something in her expression he had never seen there before, not the ancient patience, not the deep knowing, not the quality of something that has survived long enough to stop fearing the passage of time. Something new. Something that only existed in creatures who understood that time was finite and had decided, against all logic, to find that beautiful rather than unbearable. It's enough, though. Is it? It's what we have. And I have learned, her mouth curved, the first full smile he had seen from her, unguarded and unperformed over the course of a very long existence, that what we have and what we need have a way of being exactly the same thing when we stop arguing about it. The sun touched the peaks. The light changed. It went from gold to something deeper, amber and rose, and the specific color of dying light on dark stone that Michael had watched from these ramparts his whole life, without once thinking it was something anyone else would want to see. He had never had anyone to show it to. He had never permitted himself the particular vulnerability of wanting to. He stood on the ramparts of the Obsidian Peaks with Nora Garcia beside him, watching light move across mountains that were green for the first time in a century, and something in his chest that had been clenched since the first funeral, since the first grave, the first name on the first headstone, the first night he had pressed his palm to a wall and said, "I don't know what I am," unclenched. Slowly. Incompletely. The way old damage always heals. Not all the way, not without evidence, but genuinely. Truly. Enough. "I should tell you something," he said. "Tell me." The night after the first funeral. The very first night I came to the war room. He kept his eyes on the mountains. I pressed my hand to the wall and I said I didn't know what I was. He paused. "I still don't. Entirely. But I think I'm less afraid of the question than I used to be." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she reached out and pressed her warm, human, no longer luminous hand flat against his chest, the same gesture, the same place, the place where her voice had always arrived before it was a voice. "I know what you are," she said simply. He covered her hand with his. Below them, the people of the Obsidian Peaks had begun to gather at the base of the ramparts, not in fear, not in the hushed anticipatory dread of a court that had learned to brace for the king's announcements. Gathering the way people gather for something worth witnessing. He could hear them, the sound rising from the courtyard below, spreading into the streets, a sound he had no immediate reference for, and then realized, with a disorientation that went all the way down, that he did have a reference. It was celebration. Damon appeared in the towered doorway with the expression of a man who had been composing his many questions into a presentable order and had decided to set them aside indefinitely. He looked at the two of them, the king's hand over the hand of the woman pressed against his chest, the mountains green in the failing light, the sound rising from below, and his expression shifted into something that had no name and required none. He turned and went back inside. The sun finished its descent. The first stars arrived over the obsidian peaks, faint at first, then certain, the way things become certain when you stop looking for them and simply look up. Nora tipped her face toward them and smiled. And Michael Hayes, Widowmaker, cursed king, the man who had buried 9 wives and spent 9 years confessing his worst self to a wall, stood in the cold mountain air with his wife's hand against his heart and watched the first night of the rest of his mortal life arrive overhead. It was not a long life. 50 years if the healers were optimistic. It was not a safe life. There would be courts to manage and seasons to survive and the quiet, difficult daily work of 2 people learning to live inside the same walls without war room walls between them. It was not the life he had planned. It was, without question, the first life he had ever actually wanted to live. He looked down at her. She was already looking up at him. "Ask me on the 11th morning," she had said. "If it comes." It had come. And every morning after, for the next 50 years, he would wake before dawn and lie still in the dark listening for her breathing, not from dread, not from the particular vigil of a man counting coffins, but from the same reason anyone listens for the breathing of someone beside them. Because it was there. Because it was real. Because after everything, after the graves and the wall and the binding and the century of debt paid in full, the most extraordinary thing in the obsidian peaks was not the green mountains or the healed earth or the clear blue sky opening above them. It was this. Just this. A woman who had chosen to be mortal. And a king who had finally, after 9 years in the dark, learned to believe he was worth choosing. And that, my story family, is how a king who had only ever known graves finally learned to tend something living. If this story moved you the way it moved me bringing it to life, hit that like button, subscribe so you never miss what comes next, and share this with someone who needs a love story that actually earns its ending. And drop your thoughts in the comments.